Hello everyone, I'm Daniel Steele and I'm coming to you from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. In this lecture I'm going to talk to you about ethics and environmental health, and this will cover the Resnick reading from week 8. So let's get going. So one of the themes for this week's class is that the ethics of environmental health are connected to and similar in some ways to those of public health ethics more generally, but they have some distinctive features. And this will come out in the specific framework for environmental health that Resnick proposes, and we'll see how it's different than some of the public health frameworks that we talked about earlier in the term. So what's the thing that makes environmental health distinct? Well, one of the key features, and from an ethics point of view, one of the key features that's important is that environmental health ethics brings up these basic questions about humans and nature and how the two should relate to one another. And that's, in the Resnick reading, one of the main themes that he starts with. And he starts with making some philosophical distinctions between ideas that are very widely discussed in sort of Western environmental thought. So one of these is instrumental versus intrinsic value. And the idea here is that something has intrinsic value if it's valuable in its own right, if it sort of just has values above and beyond the uses that somebody might have for it. In contrast, something has instrumental value if it's valuable because it's useful for achieving other things that are valuable in themselves. So Resnick gives some examples to illustrate these. So he says human beings have intrinsic value, and that makes sense, right? Human beings just have value in themselves. Even if they're not useful for other people, you still have value. An ordinary stone, that's an example Resnick gives of something that's really only instrumentally valuable. I mean, maybe it's useful as a paperweight, maybe you can use it as as like a brick in a wall or something like that, but in and of itself it's not particularly valuable, according to Resnick. And finally, he gives a good marriage as an example of something that has both intrinsic and instrumental value. That's kind of an interesting example because we're going to, we've talked a bit about relational value, that is viewing the relationship between humans and natural entities like a river or a forest as an object of value. And so this example of a good marriage kind of brings out the idea that relationships have both intrinsic and instrumental value. A good marriage is a good thing in itself, but it's also going to have positive impacts, make you healthier, for example. In the same way, a good relationship with the river, between the humans and the river, is a good thing, but it also has benefits for both the human and the river. Okay, so as a little side exercise, you might try to think of something that has intrinsic value and something that only has instrumental value besides Resnick's examples. And we'll discuss examples like that in class. Okay. Another distinction that, again, is very common in Western environmental philosophy that's discussed in the Resnick reading is the difference between anthropocentrism and non-anthropocentrism. So anthropocentrism is the idea that only humans and characteristics of humans like happiness have intrinsic value. So if it's not a human being or some feature of a human being like happiness or a well-being of a human, then it's only instrumental value. And if you take an anthropocentric view, it doesn't mean that you think the environment doesn't matter at all and that we should just trash the whole earth or something. But it does mean that your view of environmental ethics would be different. You would kind of view it as stewardship. You want to maintain the environment, but only because that's important for humans and human well-being and survival. If there weren't any humans, you wouldn't care. Non-anthropocentrism, on the other hand, says that some non-human things, such as ecosystems or maybe non-human species, have intrinsic value. And so that's, if you look at the pictures over here, the one on the left is like the anthropocentrism, and then the non-anthropocentrism is the one here on the right. And you think of things like animal rights, that's people would believe that animals have intrinsic rights, just the way humans do. Rights of nature would also be an example of this idea that, say, a river or a forest might also have rights. So this leads us then to Resnick's framework. And Resnick's framework is sort of very, I would say, sort of loose in the sense of it has a list of principles, but it doesn't really order these principles in any particular way, and it's different from the frameworks we looked at earlier in the term, where there was a clear sort of stepwise progression that you went through when you followed the principles. This one is just you kind of consider all the principles and you just somehow sort of weigh them all in some sort of unexplained way. So here are the principles, and I'll just go through them one by one. First of all, human rights. So Resnick begins with the idea that humans have rights to a decent level of various goods, and that presumably includes environmental goods like clean air and water. And so the idea here is that when you're doing environmental health ethics, you have to consider humans and their rights, including like rights to health, for example, and that's going to matter in how you sort of weigh, say, the rights of the environment and the rights of humans. Secondly, he includes utility, like in the sense of utilitarianism, as one of the aspects of environmental health ethics. So maximize benefits, minimize social harms. So that means that you should be willing to some extent to sort of calculate and think about, okay, we have a fixed set of resources, what's the most benefit we can do, taking everything into account. And that kind of utilitarian mindset should have a place within environmental health ethics, according to Resnick. But as is clear, it's not the only principle. In addition, justice is a principle, according to Resnick, for environmental health ethics, and that includes procedural justice, which is about sort of the processes by which decisions are made, and distributive justice, which has to do with who has more or less resources, and he thinks these justice issues are relevant both at international and national levels. In addition, he thinks that animal welfare has an important role in environmental health ethics, so that we shouldn't take a totally instrumental view of animals, that animals should be viewed as having some moral standing, some level of rights in and of themselves. And he thinks that's true especially for sentient animals. And he thinks that sort of the more sentient the animals are, the more rights that they have. So maybe a clam has very little and maybe even no sort of in the way of intrinsic rights, whereas a chimpanzee would have a great deal of rights, almost as much as a human on his view. In addition, he takes a sort of enlightened anthropocentric view, and that means that he says humans are the sort of this primary basis of value. I mean, some sentient animals can be included too, especially the more higher sentient animals, but primarily humans are the basis of ethical value. And so when we're thinking about the good of the environment, ultimately you should be thinking about that in terms of how the environment is important for humans and their survival and their well-being. That said, he wants to take an enlightened view about this, which means that he wants to think in the long term. Right? So if you were to sort of rapaciously, extract a bunch of resources and then, destroy the environment for future generations, that would not be stewardship under his view. It would not be a kind of enlightened anthropocentrism, because sure, maybe the humans today get rich, but then humans in the future are just sort of screwed over. That's not good. That's not what he would recommend. And that connects to his next principle of sustainability, of using resources so as not to disrupt ecological stability or reduce or decrease biodiversity. So this is like, you need to think in the long term, and you need to think about the functioning of the environment in a long term, from a long-term perspective, so that humans can continue to benefit from the environment and all the goods that it provides. Finally, he states that precaution should be a principle of environmental health ethics. And precaution, and particularly the precautionary principle, which I'll say a little bit more about on the next slide, is based on the idea that scientific uncertainty should not be a reason against taking actions to protect human health or the environment. And here the key idea is that when you're dealing with environmental health issues, there's often a great deal of uncertainty. There's uncertainty about exactly what the effects are, about exactly what's responsible for certain effects. It can often be very difficult to draw a connection between human health outcomes and, say, pollution that's coming out of a factory or something like this, and that you should be willing to take precautions, take actions to reduce those risks, even when the evidence isn't completely certain. So let's say a little bit more about this idea, the precautionary principle. And so this is a very influential idea in environmental thought. And the idea here is that given that environmental impacts often are very difficult to reverse once they've happened, that we should be very careful about risking these kinds of serious harms to the environment. If you think of impacts like climate change, or one of the examples we talked about a few weeks ago about the pollution of this river and the grassy narrows example with the mercury poisoning. I mean, once that happens, it's very difficult to remove the mercury from the river and from the fish and all of this. And so you should really be careful about these kind of long-term harms that are very difficult to reverse. And so the precautionary principle then is going to have these sort of three conditions, these three sort of components. One is this sort of harm threshold, this idea there's some severe harm that can be difficult to reverse, and you really should be concerned about that. The second is this knowledge condition. The idea is that there's some level of evidence that should be required for taking this harm, this risk seriously, but you don't want to make that requirement of knowledge too strict, or otherwise you'll just never do anything. You'll end up having these environmental calamities that you have to sort of clean up for years and years afterwards. And then there's this precautionary action that would be recommended to, of course, reduce the risk of this harm in the example. Okay, so the precautionary principle is usually applied with constraints such as proportionality, and then of course you want to consider if you have different possible actions you could take to reduce the harm. Maybe you choose ones that are less costly if they have similar protective effects. And so this is the idea of the precautionary principle. And if you think about how these ideas could apply, here's an example to think about. Should we stop eating beef? So we talked about this example earlier in the term, in the week where I was away. And so as you learned about then, the environmental impacts of beef far exceed those of other types of agriculture. And that might suggest there's a moral obligation to reduce meat consumption. So this is something you can pause the video and think about which of Resnick's principles do you think are most relevant to this example, and why, and what might they suggest about that. And that's something we can return to in class, and we can look at this example through the lens of the framework that Resnick proposes for environmental health ethics. All right, so the takeaways for today. So the main takeaway is that although it has many overlaps, many interconnections with environmental health ethics, many connections with public health ethics, environmental health ethics raises distinctive issues. So public health ethics, environmental health ethics, there's overlap, but they're not the same thing. And one of the main things that is different is this question of how should humans relate to non-human species, to nature. And so that's why questions about things like intrinsic versus non-intrinsic value, anthropocentrism versus non-anthropocentrism, these come up as important topics and questions in environmental health ethics. The second point I'd like to take away, and this is something that connects to the second reading for this week and the second lecture as well, is that there are important connections between indigenous health and environmental health ethics. So historically and currently, unethical environmental actions within colonialism often have had very, very negative effects on the health of indigenous peoples. And as the second reading and the second lecture discusses, addressing these kinds of issues really requires sort of addressing these systems and these structures that tend to perpetuate these kinds of impacts. In addition, the ideas developed by indigenous peoples, such as valuing nature as a relation, are very relevant to environmental health ethics. And finally, one of the things that I think that's really interesting and distinctive about environmental health ethics, and especially principles within it like sustainability and precaution, is they can really recommend fundamental changes to society in ways that I think would rarely be the case for most types of public health ethics. So if you think of transitioning away from fossil fuels, or maybe you shouldn't eat meat anymore, things like that, those are just these fundamental changes that can be suggested by by thinking about environmental health ethics and environmental ethics in general. And so what that means is that environmental ethics really makes you think in many cases in a very